While Bukharin was quite passive when Stalin was completely uprooting his presence and influence in the Bolshevik Party, his protégés, quite to his dismay actually, were far more willing to take up the challenge to Stalin's war against them. In 1926, Bukharin's understanding of Marxism and the future development of socialism in the USSR was orthodox Bolshevism. It was party doctrine. Bukharin controlled Pravda. He was leader of the Comintern, and he was the only university-trained economist in the highest echelons of the party leadership. He was declared as, quote, the most outstanding theorist of the Communist International. For years he had been a party favorite, and his texts had become Bolshevik handguides. His writings were anthologized in official volumes dedicated to Marxist economics, philosophy, sociology, and literary and art criticism. When a Soviet writer to give evidence of the international fame of Bolshevik intellectual achievement, he would say, "It is sufficient to point only to the outstanding sociological and economic works of N.I. Bukharin." A charter member of the Communist Academy and its Presidium, he was the party's leading nominee and only political leader elected to the Soviet Academy of Sciences in 1928 to 1929, a final honorific testimony to his preeminence. So, it was no surprise then that Bukharin had a great deal of followers inside and outside the party. Bukharin was joined with Rykov and Tomsky to represent the party's right wing. Alexei Rykov was of peasant origin himself and was quite known for his pro-peasant attitude. Unlike most of the Bolshevik top leadership, Rykov had been ideologically consistent during his entire career as a communist, firmly representing the moderate wing of the Bolshevik Party and being opposed to left-wing and premature actions. He fully supported the NEP and its implementation, and as Premier of the Soviet Union and Chairman of the Council of Labor and Defense, he held two of the most important posts in the Soviet Union. Rykov's foil was Mikhail Tomsky, a man of proletarian origin and a veteran trade unionist. He was the chairman of the All-Union Trade Union Council, and the majority of the trade union bureaucracy was behind him and made out of him a minor cult of personality. Tomsky already supported a right-wing foreign policy due to his union sympathies, but domestically, he reconciled himself with the NEP. He saw in the unions the means by which the state connected with the working class, but also a tool for which the working class could defend itself from the state. He felt that the program of the Bolshevik left would needlessly exploit the workers, and that, at least under the new economic policy, they could see a gradual increase in standards of living and real wages. Basically, he supported the consumptionist model pushed by Bukharin. Cohen states that there is no distinctive moment when these three were identified as a trio, but that they were all issue-oriented leaders who agreed on economic and foreign policy, and that by 1926, after Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev were removed from leadership, that these three were the only full members of the Politburo who did not in some way owe their membership to Stalin. At the same time, Rykov and Tomsky had their own political and personal issues with Stalin, so an alliance with Bukharin was as much a matter of preference as it was for practical reasons. As Cohen put it, quote, circumstances, rather than design, made Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky a discernible if not fully defined political trio. And to quote him once more, the three complemented one another as political leaders. Rykov's detailed, matter-of-fact approach to economic problems was a valuable correlative to Bukharin's penchant for philosophical economics, while Tomsky's support helped dispel the pro-peasant aura of their policies. At the same time, they are men of differing inclinations. Tomsky undoubtedly would have preferred policies more immediately beneficial to unions and labor, and less obviously concerned with the peasant, and neither he nor Rykov shared Bukharin's revolutionary ebullience in foreign policy. As was true of all groupings within the leadership, theirs was a political identification shaped not by full accord, but by that which separated them from others. As Tomsky later explained, I am 30 kilometers to the right of Bukharin on international matters, but I'm 100 kilometers to the left of Stalin. Rykov, Bukharin, and Tomsky were all popular figures in their own respective domains and received support in the commissariats, which, in the era of the NEP, were staffed also by non-party specialists and former Mensheviks, much to the ire of the left wing of the Bolshevik Party. In fact, in 1929, only 12% of all state employees were communists. In the Bureau of Red Professors, Bukharin had a large number of followers, and indeed he had been inspiring students learning about Marxism since the early 1920s. The right also had a major form of support in the figure of Dzerzhinsky, the head of the GPU, and a fierce advocate of Bukharin's road to socialism. But when he died in 1926, he was replaced by Valerian Kuybyshev, who was an ally to Stalin. Much like how Zinoviev dominated party politics in Leningrad, the right had a base of support in Moscow, specifically the Moscow Committee, led by the right-winger Uglinov. When Bukharin was defeated by Stalin, it was a silent defeat. By the end of the 1920s, intra-party struggle had become covert, although not unknown. Clear language was not used. Debates were made in cloaked language, as if to disguise who the targets of this or that attack was. But those Bolsheviks who had been speaking and writing in such ways always knew what was being said. After Trotsky and the left were ousted from the party in November 1927, conflict between Stalin and the right opened up in January 1928. It started with a limited collectivization and requisitioning campaign as a result of a low grain harvest. While both Stalin and his friends, as well as Bukharin's trio, agreed that grain was being withheld, Bukharin believed that Stalin was exaggerating the scale of such hoarding and going too far with his administrative measures. In response, Stalin conceded to Bukharin, and he instructed his friend Mikoyan to avoid such excesses in their requisitioning campaigns. But despite repudiations from the center, the excesses never really stopped. In the spring of 1928, explosions took place in the mines in Shakti, which then later led to a show trial of 53 accused engineers and specialists implicated in a supposed plot to sabotage the Russian economy. While Bukharin and his allies agreed that the case in Shakti was an example of sabotage, they argued that it was an isolated case and that the wider net of non-party specialists employed by the state were loyal. In mid-1928, the right still seemed to have widespread support, and not just support, but influence and control in various government and party institutions. The party newspapers, Pravda and Bolshevik, as well as all the major newspapers in Moscow, were controlled by Bukharin's supporters. Tomsky led the trade unions and thus had influence over a mass proletarian base. Rykov's ministers in the Sovnarkom largely followed Bukharin's economic views, and elements of the secret police supported the right, most notably Genrikh Yagoda. On the Central Committee as well, Mikhail Kalinin, along with the other three, was a rightist, making at least 4 of its 9 members in favor of the current policies. In the next few months, however, things would change quite swiftly. For while Bukharin had friends in high places, Stalin had a network of lower-ranking officials that would become key in dislodging the right from their strongholds. The first big rift between Stalin and Bukharin comes around April 1928. After the first grain crisis is resolved with the emergency measures, another one unfolds, and more emergency administrative measures are taken, that is, war communist measures which Bukharin was opposed to. Tensions over the employment of these measures erupt in the summer of that year. Cohen writes, until the spring of 1928, Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky seem to have regarded differences in the leadership as negotiable, and tried to resolve them in the Politburo. Now, however, they, and especially Bukharin, were alarmed by the Stalin group's increasingly radical, uncompromising posture. Differences of opinion were becoming large and systematic. At the center of the dispute were contrary analysis of the regime's current problems, exemplified by the grain shortages and the Shakti Affair. The Bukharinists insisted that they were the result of secondary factors, the state's unpreparedness, poor planning, inflexible price policies, and negligent local officials. On the other hand, Stalin and the people around him were portraying the difficulties as having derived from structural or organic causes, and thus from the nature and deficiencies of NEP itself. In the addition to kulak hoarding, Stalinists maintained the grain crisis reflected the cul-de-sac of peasant agriculture. Both it and the Shakti episode were not transitory byproducts of, quote, faulty planning and chance mistakes, but evidence of an unavoidable intensification of the class war, a battle which had to be fought to the end. Bukharin had come to believe that Stalin was distorting and defying the party lines set down at the 15th Party Congress, and that his war communist stance would needlessly antagonize the peasantry, and not just the kulaks, but all of the peasants, thereby jeopardizing the stability of the regime and destroying the Shmichka. According to Cohen, Bukharin then called for the cessation of the extraordinary measures and for increased aid to the peasants. While Bukharin attacked Stalin's program with cloaked language, some of his younger followers attacked Stalinist officials by name. Stalin himself would go into the Bukharinist Institute of Red Professors and in disguised language attacked Bukharin's opposition to his program as liberal chatter and a break with Leninism. By June, Stalin and Bukharin's dispute ceased to be cloaked, and Bukharin increasingly began to distrust Stalin. In the newspapers, each faction daily attacked the other with their Aesopian language in polemics and circulars. Strangely, however, in July, at a party plenum, Stalin conceded and gave an extremely conciliatory compromise to Bukharin and the right. This obviously shocked Bukharin, because for the last month they had been waging an invisible war with each other. Indeed, Stalin gave so many concessions to Bukharin that the left oppositionists in exile declared that the right wing of the party had won. Trotsky in his exile even declared that Bukharin was eventually going to hunt down Stalin as a Trotskyist. But according to Cohen, Bukharin recognized that this was not his triumph, but instead the beginning of his defeat. During this meeting where Stalin gave many concessions to Bukharin, many of the delegates which Bukharin believed would support him failed to do so, and he lost the support of Kalinin and Voroshilov in the Politburo. While Bukharin was not yet fully defeated in the Central Committee, he was getting dragged in the Comintern, and all of his cautious policies and analysis of capitalism were replaced with completely opposite ones. When Bukharin stated capitalism was entering a period of stabilization, instead it was about to collapse, and communist parties everywhere needed to ramp up the struggle. When before, united fronts with left and progressive parties were promoted and encouraged, now the social democratic element was the primary enemy in the labor movement, social fascists who could not be worked with. Lastly also, every communist party needed to struggle against so-called right deviationists, basically against Bukharin's supporters and advocates of the previous policies. Bukharin himself conceded at the Sixth Comintern Congress that, quote, the right deviation now represents the central danger, whereby essentially he denounced himself in front of the Comintern. Fatefully, on July 11th, Bukharin paid a secret visit to Lev Kamenev. The reason for this visit was because he feared that Stalin was going to reconcile with the left, and he sought to move first. He confided with Kamenev about his issues with Stalin and compared him with Genghis Khan. The meetings between Bukharin and Kamenev came to nothing, and instead Trotsky leaked the meetings to the press, and Bukharin would then be caught up in a controversy. In September of 1928, Bukharin would release an article titled Notes of an Economist, which criticized, albeit without naming names, the new industrial program advocated by Stalin and drafted by his comrade Kuybyshev, a program which in Bukharin's eyes was essentially a carbon copy of that left-wing Trotskyist super-industrializer nonsense that both he and Stalin fought against just 2 years ago. In the fall of 1928, the right's strongholds began to crumble. Newspapers began to criticize Tomsky's leadership of the trade unions, and he was accused of obstructing production. Pro-right-wing officials in leading offices were dismissed, and the Bukharinist Moscow Committee, an institute of Red professors, folded to Stalinist pressure, and Bukharin's loyalists lost control of the party newspapers. During the course of this struggle, it was entirely covert. Bukharin made no efforts to publicly repudiate Stalin, and Stalin feared any open dispute from Bukharin, Rykov, or Chomsky, who constantly threatened to resign from the Politburo. Bukharin was not entirely passive in his struggle, but he was hardly active either. He practically let his defeat happen. As Cohen put it, Bukharin and his allies, quote, colluded with Stalin in confining their fateful conflict to a small private arena. When by spring of 1929, when the trio in the Politburo were politically handicapped and no longer held important positions, they still only offered passive resistance and continued to use miraged messaging to attack Stalin's policies, and now instead operated as loyal opposition more than anything else. In June, Chomsky and his followers were removed from trade union leadership. Bukharin was removed from the Comintern's executive committee, and by November, Bukharin was expelled from the Politburo, but the right wing of the party had long been destroyed by then. While Bukharin essentially accepted his fate, some of his followers were not so keen on this upset. One such person was Martin Ryutin, an outspoken advocate of Bukharin's ideas. Ryutin was born on February 13, 1890, to a peasant family in Irkutsk in far east Russia. At the age of 13, he was already working in a factory, and at 15, he became a member of the RSDLP during the 1905 revolution. In 1914, Ryutin apparently joined the Mensheviks, and in 1915, he was drafted and assigned to a reserved regiment. While in the army, he agitated amongst his unit, created a radical soldiers group, and spread socialist propaganda. When the state in the army collapsed at the beginning of 1917, Ryutin was elected to the committee of the Harbin Soviet of Workers and Soldiers. By this point, Ryutin was a Bolshevik and had worked towards a revolutionary seizure of power in Harbin. But due to demands from the Chinese government, Ryutin was forced to retreat to his home in Irkutsk, where he led Bolshevik militants in a guerrilla struggle against white forces. From 1918 onwards, Ryutin was becoming an elevated figure in the party, and he was selected as a delegate to the 10th Party Congress in 1921, signifying his ascent in the party. During the Kronstadt Revolt, Ryutin aided in its suppression. In 1924, when the party leadership in the hands of Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Stalin struck against the left, Ryutin would be elevated further in the party, and he would become a key and enthusiastic figure in the anti-Trotsky campaign. According to William Clarke, he led gangs to disrupt meetings of left oppositionists. When the left opposition led a demonstration on the anniversary of the October Revolution, he led the group of people that assaulted Ivar Smilga and Yevgeny Preobrazhensky. At the funeral of the left oppositionist and Trotsky supporter Adolf Zhov, who had recently committed suicide, instead of taking the occasion to commemorate a fallen Bolshevik, Ryutin went on stage and started to denounce the speech that Trotsky gave in eulogy of his deceased friend. Ryutin, thus, was a hardcore anti-leftist and a principal agent used in their destruction. He defended Stalin and Bukharin against attacks from the left and denounced them at every turn, declaring that their program represented the funeral of the party. By 1927, Ryutin had gone from a minor party member from the Far East to a member of the Central Committee, but literally next year that all come crashing down. In the fall of 1928, when Stalin turned against the right, after months of protests, Ryutin also, with all of the other rightists in the Moscow Party Committee, were removed. Although Ryutin was set back, he wasn't destroyed politically just yet. He continued his opposition, but he was still given party work. William Clarke writes about his new career trajectory. In September 1929, Ryutin was sent as a Central Committee commissioner to Kazakhstan to report on the progress in grain procurement in the area. Upon his return to Moscow, he submitted a scathingly negative report to the Politburo, highlighting the violence and excesses of the collectivization process and drawing the ire of Stalin and Lazar Kaganovich. Ryutin followed this formal critique of Stalin's policy of forced collectivization of agriculture with a similarly negative titled article titled Liquidating the Kulaks as a Class. The article reiterated the general criticism of the policy that he had supplied to the Politburo, highlighting that in his view, the practices underway in the collectivization drive were in violation of the decisions reached on the matter at the 15th Party Congress. Stalin responded quickly by refuting Ryutin's claims in his own article in the 21st of January 1930 edition of the journal, and removing Ryutin from his position as deputy editor. These steps notwithstanding, Stalin evidently took much of the report to heart, as several key elements of Ryutin's report to the Politburo found their way into Stalin's famous Dizzy with Success speech that was published in the 2nd of March 1930 edition of Pravda. In any event, Ryutin was in January 1930 named to a new post where he could do far less damage, that of chairman of the USSR photo film industry. On the 1st of March 1930, one day before the publication of Stalin's Dizzy with Success speech in Pravda, Ryutin was appointed a member of the Presidium of the Supreme Council of National Economy. Even though Ryutin was in a precarious position, Stalin still offered him an olive branch in the form of a position on the Central Committee in exchange for publicly denouncing the right opposition. He did not do this, and instead lost his candidate position on the CC. Stalin tried to offer Ryutin this position again, and upon rejecting Stalin twice, Stalin would write to Molotov that Ryutin was counter-revolutionary scum and that he needed to be exiled. 2 weeks after he rejected Stalin's overtures, Ryutin was accused of making slanderous comments against Stalin, being a Trotskyite, and supporting anti-Soviet uprisings, which Ryutin, obviously, emphatically denied. Ryutin was formally expelled from the party for, quote-unquote, double-dealing and attempts to disseminate right opportunist opinions. 1 week after his expulsion, he was arrested by the OGPU and charged with, quote, counter-revolutionary agitation and propaganda. In prison, he was interrogated, but he was released shortly after. In the spring of 1932, Ryutin joined together with 2 old Bolsheviks, Vasily Kalyarov and Mikhail Ivanov, as well as Vasily's son, Alexander Kalyarov, together crafted a 200-page oppositional document which was titled as Stalin and the Crisis of the Proletarian Dictatorship. This document has now come to be known as the Ryutin Platform. Ryutin and his cohorts presented this document and another titled To All Members of the VKB to a meeting consisting of them and 11 other members, where they all decided to name their little group as the Union of Marxist-Leninists. At a second meeting, it was decided to distribute the document in order to attract new members and to gauge reactions. The document, passing through many hands, found its way to former Bukharinists in the Red Professors Institute and the Moscow Party Committee, some Trotskyists in Kharkov, and also to Kamenev and Zinoviev. For almost a century, the actual contents of this document were unknown, and the wider Western world was only aware of this controversy because the Menshevik Boris Nikolaevsky revealed them through his anonymously published Letter of an Old Bolshevik. In Ryutin's platform, he discusses several topics. He provides an economic and political critique of the 5-year plan and provides an alternative program for the party to take. However, a large part of the work is an attack on Stalin's leadership failures and his personality. Throughout the book, he attaches a series of negative traits to Stalin. He calls him a sophist, a demagogue, a phrasemonger, a liar, an intriguer, an opportunist, a dictator among the likes of Jorge Mussolini and Primo de Rivera, and the gravedigger of the revolution. This document is quite unique amongst the Bolshevik anti-Stalin pieces in that it actually uses Lenin's last testament as a source, while Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Bukharin had all avoided using that document. Ryutin brings it up immediately, literally on the first page. Ryutin states that Lenin called for Stalin's removal from the position of general secretary, and that he determined Stalin had poor character qualities such as rudeness, dishonesty, and insufficient loyalty. According to Ryutin, if Stalin was insufficiently loyal when Lenin was still alive, then since his death, he has become an open betrayer. Party history since Stalin's ascendancy had been falsified to inflate Stalin's role in the history of the revolution, and various textbooks were thrown out for containing, quote, Trotskyist contraband. For Ryutin, Stalin's Napoleon moment, his 18th Brumaire, was in the years 1924 to 1925. He writes, like Louis Bonaparte, he was prepared to swear before the chamber his loyalty to the Constitution, and simultaneously was prepared to proclaim himself as the emperor. Stalin, too, in a struggle with Trotsky and thereafter with Zinoviev and Kamenev, declared that he was fighting for collective leadership of the party, and that to run the party outside the Collegium is impermissible, that it is impossible to run the party without Rykov, Bukharin, Tomsky, that the blood of Bukharin we shall not give to you, that the politics of slaughter for us is nasty, and simultaneously prepared for a bloodless 18th Brumaire. This involved producing one group after another for the party apparatus of the Central Committee, and also for the Gubernia Committee and the Provincial Committee, comprising men personally loyal to him. According to Ryutin, Stalin was an unprincipled intriguer, as well as a political plagiarist. One day, Stalin supported one thing, the next, he supported another. When Stalin went from right to left, what had been considered as Leninism was now right opportunism, and what earlier was declared as Trotskyism now came to be known as Leninism. When, before, a slow pace of industrialization was authentic Leninism, now it was talk of bourgeois vermin. Stalin was opposed to an increase in prices of industrial goods. Now, such increases have led to a massive growth in industry. When Kamenev struck against the kulaks in 1925, Stalin scoffed at his exaggeration of their strength. But now, the kulaks are an omnipresent and omnipotent force presently menacing socialist construction. In 1927, Stalin says socialism can't be built in a country facing revolts and bandit uprisings. Now, he states that such uprisings were but the natural result of the gigantic successes in the construction of socialism. In 1925, Stalin said that communists must, quote, manage without kindling of class struggle with the kulaks, and that the slogan of sharpening class struggle was counter-revolutionary. Now, he advocates exactly that slogan. According to Ryutin, Stalin's policy in the countryside has been disastrous. And, ironically, Stalin's prior prophecies about fermenting civil war in the countryside had been completely justified. Ryutin then accuses Stalin and his clique of blatantly lying about the successes of their plans. He writes, Stalin frequently resorts to substitution of one controversial question by another. Thus, for example, in 1931, it was proposed to increase production by 45%, lowering the cost price by 10% more, and instead of this, we have increase, even by falsified statistics, of everything by 20%. Not considering the gigantic worsening of the quality of production. In such a situation, elementary obligation of any honest leader is to declare 1. That the plan in the main has not been fulfilled less than half. 2. That the methods of planning turned out to be unfit and that they must be revised and reconstructed. Instead, Stalin himself remains silent and through his click and stamp screams, "We have achieved gigantic successes in the third decisive year of the plan, although the plan remains underfulfilled." Today, increase in production by 20% and 13 or 15% by a quick tempo appears to him as opportunistic, and the next day, only 30% is considered Bolshevik tempo. Then, suddenly, 45% appear as real Bolshevik tempo, and 30% as opportunistic. And if the program's 45% are fulfilled by only 20%, then also these 20% pass for genuine Bolshevik tempo. Ryutin declares that Stalin inflates the good examples of the plan being fulfilled, while conveniently ignoring the many failures of the plan, calling them dark spots, when allegedly those dark spots represent 85% of workers' industries. With the press in his hands, Stalin conceals these facts and zero criticism is seen. Ryutin reports that, while the media was loudly and proudly preaching the successes of the plan, the textile industry, which employs 600,000 workers, stood still for months due to lack of raw materials, and that numerous other industries only operated at half capacity. The apparent miracles that the 5-year plan was achieving came at the cost of numerous other industries being neglected, and peasant rage in the countryside. Next, he harshly attacks Stalin's credentials as a theoretician. In Ryutin's eyes, to place Stalin's name next to that of Marx, Engels, and Lenin means to scoff at the legacy of these men. For Ryutin, to place Stalin's name next to Marx's was akin to placing Mount Elbrus next to a pile of shit. While in the press, Stalin is canonized as Lenin's greatest student and an amazing leader. Ryutin knows that Stalin, like every other Bolshevik, does not have a clean resume. Firstly, Ryutin states that Stalin did not take a defeatist stance and was aligned with Trotsky and Martov at the Zimmerwald Conference. Secondly, during the February Revolution, Stalin supported the provisional government. Third, according to Ryutin, Stalin's support of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty was not for internationalist reasons, but for national Bolshevik reasons. And lastly, Ryutin complains that Stalin transformed the Chinese Communist Party into an appendage of the KMT, which then resulted in their total massacre in Shanghai. To speak about Stalin as a theoretician before 1917 is simply funny. All his theoretical works before 1917 came down to 3 small articles on the question of nationality, to be located at that time in Enlightenment, and thereafter, during the initial years of the revolution, published as separate brochures. These articles represent themselves as a very mediocre write-up on the views of Lenin on the problems of nationality only. Further, there is his collection of articles on the paths to October. As we have already noted, that the first articles of his collection, read before the arrival of Lenin, are semi-Menshevik. What is of concern are the remaining pieces, in which the author shows himself as an extremely mediocre theorist of weak Marxist erudition. The stamp of limitedness, of immobility, of sketchiness, of narrowness, of mental horizon and weak erudition of the author lies even in all his remaining works, including even in the best and most valuable Problems of Leninism. In his works, what is to be found is not any rich theoretical baggage, but only the ability and skill to hide his wretchedness. That was just so, that we have before us a theoretician who is a crow in peacock's feathers. At the 16th Party Congress, Stalin declared that the Soviet Union had entered into the first period of socialism. At the 17th Party Conference, Molotov loudly proclaimed that they had entered into the first phase of communism, and that, therefore, the Soviet Union was already socialist in 1930. The party highlights a numerous set of achievements, such as the elimination of parasitic classes and unemployment, and they go on to claim that in the Soviet Union, exploitation no longer existed. Ryutin states that if what the conference stated was true, then the USSR really would be entering into a socialist society. But according to Ryutin, not even the worst enemy of communism, the greatest provocateur, could have come up with something better than Stalin's proclamation through the mouth of Molotov that the USSR was presently a socialist society, even in its first stage. In the rest of the platform, Ryutin declares that, regardless of whatever Stalin and his clique say, that their policies have nothing to do with Marxism-Leninism. That, regardless of Trotsky's mistakes, the October Revolution will forever be tied with his name and Lenin's. That Bukharin was a far better Marxist than Stalin, and 10 times more of a follower of Lenin. That the means by which Stalin discarded Bukharin was marked with dishonesty. And finally, Ryutin states that Stalin had accrued in himself more power than any previous monarchy or absolutist state had before. In the final conclusion of his attack on Stalin, he writes, "The primary duty of all honest, genuine leaders of the party is not to contemptibly grovel before Stalin and deceive the masses, as is being done by Bukharin and Radek, and even not to keep silence, as Rykov, Tomsky, Uglanov, and the former leaders of the Trotskyite opposition are doing. The duty of the genuine leaders and true Leninists at present is not to make excuses of the alleged passivity of the masses, not to justify their own inaction with a lack of support from party members and party workers who are badgered, crushed, terrorized, but to search for leadership in the struggle against Stalin and stand at the head of the party and the non-party workers, to lead them. Such is the obligation of genuine leaders, of genuine Leninists at present. Now precisely the time has come which demands new, open action from all the former leaders, from all honest Bolsheviks, who have to come out of the blind alley with their open, bold agenda and return to the Leninist principles to guide the country by proletarian dictatorship. Otherwise, history will forever nail them to the pillory." At the end of the book, Ryutin calls explicitly for the, quote, liquidation of the dictatorship of Stalin and his clique, as well as a couple dozen other concrete measures to ensure the survival of the proletarian dictatorship. But the proposal, which is the most important, not just for Ryutin, but for the whole ruling nomenclature, was that one which called for Stalin's removal. This was the first measure listed, and certainly the most impactful. Not even 2 weeks after Ryutin's platform began circulating amongst party members, they were snitched on and arrested by the OGPU. Ryutin and his group were declared to be White Guard counter-revolutionary terrorists who formed a bourgeois kulak group that was working for the restoration of capitalism under the guise of Marxism-Leninism. When this document came to the attention of the Politburo and Stalin, he insisted that this oppositional platform was calling for his assassination, and he demanded for Ryutin and his collaborators to be executed. Ironically, it was Sergei Kirov, the person who was allegedly the victim of an assassination by the opposition in 1934 and whose death caused the Great Purge, who prevented this from occurring. And instead, Ryutin was expelled from the party and sent into exile. At the same time, because of Zinoviev and Kamenev's failure to report the existence of this document, they were expelled from the party again and then exiled to the Urals before being allowed to return later in 1933. During the Great Purge and under Yezhov's leadership of the secret police, Ryutin was taken from prison and reinterrogated. He refused to confess to any charges of being a part of a counter-revolutionary conspiracy. In a 1936 letter, he would write, "I do not acknowledge any guilt except in regard to the reasons for the lengthy sentence which I am presently serving. I have never been a terrorist. I am not now, nor will I ever be. I have never had terrorist views or sentiments, nor do I now. I have at no place or time ever expressed any sympathy for terror, and I have always had a hostile attitude toward it. This new interpretation of certain quotes from the documents as terroristic is clearly biased and tendentious. The articles of the criminal code under which I was sentenced encompassed and undoubtedly still encompass the aggregate of criminal acts committed by me and my criminal views, but those articles do not contain any accusations of terrorism. Consequently, neither my documents nor any actions contain then or now any element of terrorism. If that were not the case, then other appropriate articles of the criminal code would have been applied to me at that time. There is not a single act of criminal legislation, from Roman law to the present day in all countries, including Soviet criminal law, which permits an individual to be tried for the same crime 2 times, even if the crime is called by a different name the second time." On January 9th, 1937, Ryutin would be convicted and executed on the same day. The entire time, during the whole charade, he professed his innocence, and unlike so many others, he never confessed to any guilt or wrongdoing. The importance of the Ryutin Affair, as it has been called, cannot be understated, for this one document, the so-called terrorist document, was used to directly implicate the likes of Kamenev, Zinoviev, Bukharin, and so many others in a supposed counter-revolutionary plot. In all of the trials of the oppositionists, whether left or right, this document was used to connect them to one or another scheme to destroy the Soviet Union. When the trial of the right opposition took place, each of the accused were determined to not just be knowledgeable, but complicit in Ryutin's activities. Even though the document blatantly and unabashedly criticized Bukharin, Tomsky, and Rykov, Stalin accused Bukharin of being the document's actual author and stated that he wrote criticisms of himself for the sake of the conspiracy. This document alone not only helped to kill dozens during the Moscow trials, it was one of those key events, such as Hitler's rise to power and the death of Kirov, that eventually led to the murders, arrests, and dismissals of thousands of party members in the mid to late 1930s. Although this book was buried for 60 years, it was a pivotal moment in Soviet history.